1,500 years ago, one man almost did the impossible. He began to piece the fallen Roman Empire back together, taking it from the barbarians, province by province. North Africa, Italy, the eternal city itself. Imagine you are piecing together a broken vase that is 1,000 years old, and you almost succeeded. Only one fragment remains, and just at that moment, everything falls apart in his hands, and not in war. What can bring down an entire empire if neither barbarians nor hunger nor its own emperors, who changed more often than passwords, could do it before? Why did the most ambitious plan in history fail? Not because of the sword, not because of an enemy army, and not even because of betrayal. And how did it happen that the person who was one step away from rewriting the entire history of Europe is almost forgotten by name today? The answer is so absurd that it is still hard to believe. The enemy that brought all this down cannot be seen with the eyes at all. It had neither an army nor a plan nor even a brain, and it only took a couple of years and one ship with grain where the barbarians needed several centuries. But to understand how frustrating this turned out, you first need to get to know the person who had everything taken away. And believe me, he has one of the strangest career paths in history. Don't one you right away. Watch until the end, because closer to the finale, there will be a story about how a few monks with sticks pulled off the first industrial espionage operation in history 1,000 years before the word espionage even appeared. And along the way, we encounter a year when the sun went out over the entire planet, and a historian who wrote official laudatory chronicles by day and, forgive me, undermined his own boss by night. Imagine a village in the mountains in what is now modern-day Macedonia. At the beginning of the 6th century, there lives an ordinary peasant boy named Peter Savati. No prospects, no future. The most he can expect is to herd cattle all his life and die at 40 from something completely ordinary. And then he discovers he has an uncle. The uncle's name is Justin, and he once left this same village for Constantinople literally on foot with a bag of rusks on his back. He enlisted in the army and started his career from the very bottom. A small detail. Justin could not read at all. According to one version, later, when he became emperor, he signed documents using a special stencil with cutouts, just to trace his signature along the outline. Yes, you understood correctly where this is going. An illiterate soldier from a village rose to become the commander of the palace guard. And then, in the year 518, when the old emperor died without leaving an heir, somehow ended up being the only person who had the troops, the money, and all the necessary connections at the right moment. And he became emperor. The first thing he does is call his nephew from the village, give him the best education in the empire, and change his name to Justinian. From shepherd to heir to the throne, because his uncle got lucky. Every time someone tells you that connections don't matter, remember this family. By the time Justinian gains power himself in the year 527, he is no longer a village boy. This is one of the most educated people of the era, working 18 hours a day. Contemporaries called him the emperor who never sleeps. Some of them meant his diligence. Another part, apparently, meant that the person was simply frightening. And now about his wife, because without her, nothing would have happened. Theodora was the daughter of a man who tended bears at the Hippodrome, and she worked as an actress. In 6th century Byzantium, the word actress meant roughly the same as a woman without any reputation. According to the law, a person of senatorial rank was not allowed to marry her in principle. Justinian solved this problem elegantly. He asked his uncle to change the law. The uncle changed it, and they got married. And now comes the year 532, a moment when everything almost ended before it really began. A rebellion breaks out in Constantinople, which will go down in history under the name Nika, after the crowd's chant, which means conquer. It all started notably with the fans. There were two fun groups at the Hippodrome, the Blues and the Greens, and these were not just fans but a full-fledged political force, something between football ultras and a party. At some point, the Blues and the Greens, who usually hated each other, united against the emperor. It's roughly like if fans of two arch-rivals suddenly decided to storm City Hall together. Half the city is on fire. The crowd has already proclaimed a new emperor. Justinian is sitting in the palace, and he has a ship ready to escape. It's over. The game is lost. Save and exit. And then Theodora stands up and says something that will be quoted for the next 1,500 years. The gist is, you can run. Money is there, ships are ready, the sea is nearby. But think, will you want to live after this? And she adds, purple is a beautiful shroud. Purple, by the way, is the color of imperial power. Justinian stays. And here, pause for a second and look at what just happened. The empire, all the campaigns, and everything we will talk about in the next 15 minutes survived only because one person opened their mouth at the right moment and said what they thought. One voice against already packed suitcases. I mean, that one voice actually decides much more than it seems, and this channel is set up exactly the same way. So if you're interested in how this story ended, subscribe. It will take a second, and in terms of influence, it will be like Theodora's speech, only without 30,000 corpses. And now comes the part that is usually omitted in romantic retellings. Loyal troops log the crowd in the Hippodrome and kill, according to various estimates, up to 30,000 people in one day. The uprising is suppressed, power is saved. The former actress has just saved the empire and at the same time participated in one of the bloodiest massacres of the century. The Middle Ages, I remind you, continue. And remember this burned city. In 5 years, on its ashes, a building will rise that will outlast everything we are talking about today, including the empire itself. But we will get to that later. So the year 533. Justinian is on the throne, the city lies at his feet, there is money, there is an army, and he looks at the map. And on the map, the picture, to be honest, is sad. The western half of the Roman Empire has not existed for half a century by this point. Italy belongs to the Ostrogoths. North Africa, the granary of ancient Rome, belongs to the Vandals. Spain to the Visigoths. That is half of what was called Rome for 1,000 years now, belongs to people whom the Romans themselves recently called barbarians and tried not to let pass the border. And Justinian thinks, why not take it all back? The idea is, to put it mildly, ambitious. It's like if someone today decided to single-handedly restore the USSR and the empire of Alexander the Great, and by Friday no less. But Justinian had two things his predecessors did not: money, which he extracted from the empire through taxes so effectively that he is still criticized for it. And Belisarius. Belisarius is perhaps the most underrated general in history. He was just over 30 when he was tasked with reconquering North Africa. About 15,000 men were allocated for this. For comparison, the Vandals had held this territory for 100 years and had once managed to sack Rome itself. Belisarius landed in Africa in the autumn of 533. By the spring of 534, it was all over. An entire kingdom that stood for a century was dismantled in a few months by a man whose forces would have been enough for just one decent garrison. The last Vandal king, Gelimer, fled to the mountains and stayed there under siege until he realized it was pointless. And here occurs one of the most humane episodes in this whole story. Gelimer sent a note to the besiegers asking for 3 things. Bread, because he hadn't eaten proper bread for a long time, a sponge, because his eyes were inflamed, and a lyre, because he composed a song about his misfortune and would like to sing it. I have read a lot about this era, but this is still my favorite surrender in history. A man lost a kingdom and asked for a musical instrument to sing a song about it. Then Gelimer was brought to Constantinople and paraded through the streets in triumph, the first true Roman triumph in over 500 years. It is said that as he walked past the jubilant crowd, he repeated a phrase from Ecclesiastes: "Vanity of vanities, all is vanity." Given the circumstances, it's hard to argue with him. After Africa, Belisarius receives his next assignment, Italy. It all starts just as beautifully. As Sicily falls almost without a fight, Naples is taken. In the year 536, Belisarius enters Rome, and for the first time in 60 years, the Eternal City belongs to the Roman Emperor again. Even if it's an emperor who sits in Constantinople and speaks Greek, but still. Constantinople rejoices. Justinian mentally hangs a banner. Mission accomplished. Half of the dream is completed in 3 years. And here, history sneaks up from behind and says, and now, hold on. Because exactly in the year 536, the very year when Belisarius takes Rome, something happens that no one can explain. The sun dims. This is not a metaphor. Contemporaries write about this directly. Procopius, a historian who was with Belisarius and saw everything personally, records that the sun gave light without brightness all year, like the moon. And this continued for about 18 months. Another author writes that the fruits did not ripen, and the wine tasted like sour grapes. In Ireland, chronicles record a poor grain harvest. In China, it snows in the summer. Modern science, having studied ice cores and tree rings, states quite confidently, these were massive volcanic eruptions that released so much ash into the atmosphere that it blocked the sun for months. Apparently, there were several eruptions, around the year 536 and around 540. Now imagine this through the eyes of a person from the 6th century. You have no satellites, no news, no explanations. One day the sun simply dims. And so it continues for a year and a half. The harvest does not grow, people are starving, and no one can say when it will end or if it will end at all. Historians today seriously call the year 536 one of the worst years in human history to be alive. And now comes the most frustrating part, because the dim sun and hunger, it turns out, were just a warm-up. The present came 5 years later, and it came not with an army, but on schedule on a cargo ship, because a starving and weakened population is an ideal target. It all started in Egypt at a regular trading station where someone simply fell ill. Then this thing calmly boarded a grain ship, which coincidentally was heading straight to Constantinople because the capital needed something to eat. So the most terrifying package in human history arrived through completely legal logistics, with documents on schedule and intact. In the spring of 542, it reached the capital. Procopius described the events as an eyewitness, and his text is still difficult to read. People woke up with a slight fever, nothing serious. By evening, they developed swellings in the groin and armpits. The very same buboes. Then some fell into a coma, others into delirium. Some imagined demons were chasing them. Many died on the second or third day. Some suddenly recovered. And there was no logic at all in who exactly would survive. Mortality on peak days, according to reports from that time, reached up to 5, and according to some sources, even up to 10,000 people per day. The figures of ancient authors should always be divided by something, but even cautious modern estimates say that the city lost a huge part of its population. And then begins the logistical nightmare that you usually don't even think about. The cemeteries were full, and there was physically nowhere and no one to bury the dead. Justinian appointed a separate official whose sole task was to deal with the bodies. The solution they found was this. In the suburb across the bay, they opened up watchtowers, removed their roofs, and started stacking bodies inside, layer by layer, until the towers were filled to the top. Then the towers were sealed. Procopius writes that the wind from that direction brought a smell into the city that was impossible to escape. Work came to a halt, markets emptied. And there is one detail he mentions that truly makes you uneasy. In the streets, he writes, it became impossible to understand who was in front of you because everyone walked without servants, without escorts, often in someone else's clothes, and a person of senatorial rank could bury their own dead with their own hands because there was simply no one else. Even Justinian himself fell ill and survived, which by those standards could be considered a personal cheat. The problem is that the empire around him did not receive any cheats. And then comes the most boring and at the same time the most destructive part, the part that is usually cut out in movies because it's about accounting. The plague kills not only people, it kills the economy. Fewer peasants, less harvest, fewer taxes, less money for the army, less money for the army. And now you are a great empire that physically cannot afford its own great dream. And money is needed right now. Because Italy, which Belisarius seemed to have already reconquered, had not actually surrendered completely. The Ostrogoths, recovering from the initial shock, choose a new king named Totila, and he turns out to be a very, very troublesome opponent. Totila understands a simple thing. The Byzantines have few people and little money, so he needs to buy time and hit the weak spots, and thus begins what will go down in history as the Gothic War.
20 years of sticky, exhausting struggle. The turmoil in which cities change hands several times. Rome changes ownership 5 times during this war. 5! The oldest city in Europe turns into a passing prize that no one can hold on to. And at some point, according to Procopius, the city is completely empty. Not a single person inside the walls for about 40 days. The place that for 1,000 years was the center of the world stands completely empty, like a set after filming. The population of Italy during this war drops catastrophically. Aqueducts are destroyed, fields are not sown, and here lies the main horror of the entire operation. The country they came to liberate was destroyed precisely by the war for its liberation. The Goths, who were to be expelled, had actually preserved Italy over the previous half-century of rule because they lived there themselves. The liberation was successful. The liberated did not survive. By the way, how do we even know all this in such detail? This era had its own personal chronicler who was in the thick of events, and there's a separate story with him that you won't forget. And since I'm referring to Procopius for the 3rd time, I need to explain who this person was, because that's a separate plot. Procopius was the secretary of Belisarius and the official historian of the era. During the day, he wrote The History of Wars, a completely decent, serious book where Justinian is a great emperor and Belisarius is a great commander. Everything was dignified and respectful. And then, around the year 550, he wrote another book. It was not published during his lifetime, remained unknown for almost 1,000 years, and surfaced only in the 17th century in the Vatican Library. It's called The Secret History, and this, is the most epic leak in the history of literature. In this book, Procopius writes that Justinian was not an emperor, but a demon in human form, that servants allegedly saw how at night his head disappeared from his shoulders while his body continued to walk around the palace. That Theodora behaved in such a way that descriptions of it are still printed with omissions, and that both of them deliberately destroyed the empire because they were sent by evil forces to do so. So, for decades, the man wrote official laudatory chronicles while secretly compiling a text where he called his boss a headless demon. Everyone who has ever sent an extremely polite letter while thinking something entirely different has just found their spiritual ancestor. Historians still debate what of this is true. Most likely, almost nothing except the general sentiment. For 20 years, the person observed this era up close and by the end, apparently just hated all its participants. But it would be unfair to end only on this note because 3 things from Justinian have survived the plague, the war, and himself. The first is Hagia Sophia. After the Nika Revolt, half of Constantinople lay in ruins, including the main cathedral. Justinian decided to build something in its place that had never existed before. It was built in 5 years, unbelievably fast for such a scale. And in the year 537, it was opened. The dome was so enormous and appeared so light that contemporaries wrote it seemed to be suspended from the sky on a golden chain. According to legend, upon entering, Justinian exclaimed, "Solomon, you've surpassed you. The building still stands today." 1,500 years of earthquakes, changes of empires and religions, and it still stands. The second is the Code of Laws. Justinian gathered lawyers and made them sort through 1,000 years of accumulated Roman law, discard contradictions, and compile everything into a unified system. The resulting code formed the basis of the legal systems of almost all of continental Europe. If you sabi si Weber signed the contract, you have indirectly benefited from the work of the team that this person set to sort out the legal mess of 1,500 years ago. The third, and this one I like the most. Around the year 552, several monks came to Justinian and proposed the deal. They knew how silk was produced and could bring the secret from China. The Chinese had guarded this secret for centuries. The penalty for exporting silkworms was death. The monks traveled and returned with silkworm eggs hidden, according to legend, inside hollow staffs. That is, the first industrial espionage operation in history was carried out by monks with staffs 1,000 years before the word espionage even appeared. And it worked. Byzantium established its own silk production and held a monopoly on it in Europe for the next several centuries. Justinian dies in 565, at the age of approximately 82. Formally, he won. North Africa is returned. Italy is returned. Part of Spain is returned.
On the map, the empire looks almost like before. The problem is that behind this beautiful map lies a depleted treasury, depopulated provinces, and an army chronically lacking people. And here, history does its favorite sneaky thing. It waits exactly 3 years. In 568, the Lombards, another Germanic people, enter northern Italy and take over most of the country almost without resistance. The very same country that Belisarius and his successors had reconquered over 20 years at the cost of plague, famine, and ruined cities. Italy, exhausted by the war for its own liberation more than by any previous invasion, simply cannot defend itself. There is even a legend that the Lombards were invited by Narses, the very general who ultimately defeated the Goths, offended by his retirement. Historians mostly do not believe this, but agree it would be very much in the spirit of the era. At this point, the dream of reclaiming all of Rome dies completely. And it dies not by the sword, not by a great battle, and not by a brilliant enemy, but by a bacterium that had neither an army, nor a plan, nor even a brain. The idea was good. The general was the best of the era. The emperor worked 18 hours a day and did not give up even when his own city was burning outside his windows. Just at the most critical moment, an unforeseen force majeure arrived, which was not in any plan. And for the next 3 centuries, the Mediterranean lived with what was left of it. Sometimes everything collapses, not because someone was stronger, but because someone sneezed in the wrong port. If you think that a dim sun plus plagues plus a lost Italy is rock bottom, then I have bad news. In just a few decades, a force will emerge from the desert that will take 2/3 of the territory from Constantinople in 1 generation, faster than anything you've seen today. I will make a video about this defeat if this video gets 1,000 likes. So now you literally decide whether we find out how it all ended or not.